Good evening and welcome. I'm Kyle Saunders, Associate Professor of Political Science at Colorado State University, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's discussion. Tonight, from the chambers of the Fort Collins City Council, the city is presenting this forum on voting methods to inform citizens about the strengths and weaknesses of the ranked voting system, which will be on the ballot measure before the voters of the city on April 5th. I welcome all of you in attendance this evening, as well as those of you watching live. For those of you in attendance, if you have any more questions for the panel, we've already got quite a few via note card outside, but please feel free to submit them. We'll get them up here to the podium. If you're watching at home and you'd like to send a question in, you can send one via Twitter at Kyle L. Saunders or use the hashtag FCGov. We hope to get to many of those questions towards the end of the show. Elections are the only direct mechanism by which choices representing the public will are expressed to the institutions of government. Elections are also one of the few processes by which office holders who represent the public trust are held accountable. Without the direct linkage of elections, the execution of democracy as we know it would lack all legitimacy. So obviously, we need to do what we can to get elections right. In our elections, individual voters are meant to articulate their preferences between a slate of candidates for each office being contested. In the electoral system we currently have, and have had for a very long time, and the one we're used to, a voter's preference is expressed by a single punch on the ballot for each particular office in which the voter chooses who they most prefer. This method has resulted in what could be argued to be a stable political system that reflects the preferences of the electorate in a certain way. Still, it's important to understand why our electoral system is the way that it is. So let's go a little deeper. Unlike some other electoral systems in the world, the vast majority of offices contested in elections in the United States have just one winner. It's called a plurality single winner type of system. The single winner aspect of the system is embedded in the constitutions of federal and state electoral systems, and it's not going to change very easily or anytime soon. However, the other aspect of the system we currently have, I described with the word plurality, also known as first past the post. This means that as a decision rule, whoever gets the most votes in an election wins. It's simple and it's easy to understand. A plurality of voters, though, can fall well short of a majority, especially if there are many candidates contesting a particular election. Now, there are many methods by which voter preferences can be aggregated. Preference voting, Condorcet system, the Buckland method, all of these are available out on the internet if you'd like to look them up. Each of them has their pros and cons and their strengths and weaknesses. The focus of our discussion this evening will be the preference system known as instant runoff voting, or the ranked voting method, which is under consideration, as I said, on April 5th as a potential voting method for municipal elections in Fort Collins. The basic point to understanding the ranked voting system is that in this system, voters rank candidates in their order of preference. After counting all the votes, if no candidate wins a clear majority of the voters' first preferences at the outset, ballots are recounted in rounds simulating a series of runoffs. Each ballot is counted as a vote for the candidate ranked highest by the voter. Then the candidate with the smallest number of first preferences is eliminated and the ballots are recounted. Now, from a voter's perspective, this means that if the candidate I ranked first comes in fourth in a four-way race, after the results are counted, that candidate is eliminated. But my ballot is not worthless. It's not thrown out. The ballots are recounted, and the candidate I ranked second becomes my preference in the next round of calculated results. The process then continues until only two candidates remain, or until one candidate has more votes than the combined vote total of all the other candidates, or a majority. So in an effort to help you learn more about the pros and cons of ranked voting, we're happy to be joined by, from left to right, Rudy Zitti, a retired police officer, Trita Anastasia of the Colorado Voter Choice Task Force, John Clark, former Fort Collins City Councilman and former Larimer County Commissioner, and Eric Freed, co-chair of the Fort Collins Ranked Voting Committee. Mr. Freed, I'll begin with you, and I'll ask all of you to answer this question. I would ask all of you to summarize your positions in answering the following question. Why do you think it is important for Fort Collins to either change to the ranked voting system or maintain the single choice system that we have now?
Well, first of all, thanks for explaining how instant runoff voting works, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think ranked choice voting is a fairer system that's fairer to the candidates and fairer to the voters and produces a more representative outcome than the system we have now. The system we have now, plurality voting in Fort Collins, you don't need any kind of a threshold to win, and people sometimes misunderstand. The candidate with the most votes wins, but that does not require a majority. So we've elected people with as little as 30% of the vote. Now, we don't know what the majority preference really is, and if you only have 2 candidates running, then plurality voting works very well. Obviously, one candidate gets more. But with 3 or more, the candidate who wins does not necessarily get a majority. Now, with a ranked voting system, that tends to promote a majority winner. I'll give you a very easy example. If you have 2 conservative candidates running and 1 liberal candidate running, and the conservatives get, 60% of the vote, but they split it, you may very well elect the liberal candidate, even though the clear majority did not want that candidate. And it seems to me that in a democratic republic, as we have, the winning candidate should represent the wishes of the majority. So that's the main advantage of ranked voting. It also allows candidates to run for office without taking votes away from a similar candidate and therefore being a spoiler or splitting the vote. And under the current system we have, it deters candidates from running, and we might get into that later. We've already had 2 candidates drop out of this race. We had 2 drop out of the 2009 race because they didn't want to take votes away from another candidate. So,
okay. Mr. Clark?
Oh, thank you very much. While I appreciate the things that excuse me, Eric said, history has shown that there are an awful lot of jurisdictions that have adopted the ranked form of voting and then after using it for a cycle or 2 in elections have backed away and said we don't want to do it anymore. It's confusing. People don't really understand exactly how to mark the ballots. It's costly because even in the legislation that was passed that allows this to happen, on a state level, legislation was passed to allow it to happen throughout the state of Colorado. It shows that there's money that needs to be spent for voter education as to how to use the system. That is going to cost extra money. I object to that part. And I think there is a better way to do this. If you really, really want to have a majority of votes, first thing, and you want to have a bigger turnout, the first thing you do is you move the elections out of the spring and you move them into the November cycle and hold municipal elections in conjunction with the regular primary and general elections that are held every 2 years. And that way you can let a group of candidates come forward and run in the primary, select the top 2 from that group, and then let them run against each other. And by golly, one of them is going to get over 50% of the votes because there are only 2 of them. Okay. And you can do that in conjunction with elections that are already held when voter interest is very high and people are working it out. And if you look at the statistics, you'll find that in a general election in the fall, the turnout is over double what we've had in the best municipal election we've ever had in Fort Collins.
Okay. Dr. Anastasia.
Thanks, Kyle. I think John has different stats than I have because all the exit polls that I've reviewed show that over 95% of the people that go through this kind of process completely understand it and feel really confident in using it. So I don't see the same stats that you're looking at. And also in terms of saying that multiple people have pulled out, really there are way more municipalities that are still using it than have changed their mind. And so I find it interesting that you imply that that's not the case. The reasons that I am in favor of ranked voting, I sat on the Voter Choice Task Force and I reviewed every type of voting method there possibly was in that process, and I met with the vote machine purveyors. I met with the people that do the software to count votes, learned a lot about really how the systems are already in place, they're available, they're easy to access. The main reason in my mind, and I think in the minds of the people on the task force, which did represent all parties, all ethnicities, genders, and rural, urban, everyone was on that task force trying to represent Colorado. And in that process, only 2 people in the very end were really still opposed to it. And out of the multitude of us that were on the committee, and we all went in not knowing. But by the end, we were all really firmly convinced. And the 2 that were not really were, I believe, were still confused because they both felt like any alternative voting system would allow more than one vote per person. And so they felt like it was unconstitutional, which ranked voting does not do, because once the votes are counted, there's still only one vote per person that's counted. So the reason I'm in favor of it is because it eliminates the spoiler effect completely gets rid of the spoiler effect, increases exit polls and everything where it's in place. Positive campaigning goes up, negative campaigning declines. That was probably the biggest one for me. So,
Mr. Zitti.
Okay, well, I appreciate those comments, but perhaps there's many things that could be changed about our electoral system, but our current voting system is not one of them. I feel that our current system has been used for well over 100 years. It's reliable, tested, it's verifiable, it has integrity, and it has the confidence of the voters. Ranked voting isn't any of these things. It's confusing, it's complicated, particularly to count, it's expensive, it disenfranchises some voters, and it doesn't always produce a majority winner as claimed. So in many of the cities that have tried it, have dumped it. Others, as you say, that are still using it, have a lot of problems with this voting system. I just feel that from the data that I have found, that ranked voting, we've also been down this road before. It was tried in the early 1900s, and many cities such as Cleveland and Cincinnati, New York, tried it, and there were, in fact, at that time around 20 cities using it around 1915, and all of them abandoned it for our current system. So there is some evidence there that it's been tried before and it didn't work. Ranked voting in many ways undermines the integrity of the voting process, and we can get into that later if you like. So I'll go back to my opening remarks. Why throw away a current system, which is reliable, it's been tested, it's verifiable, people have confidence in it, it has great integrity, and it's simple. So my choice is one person, one vote, the simple measure.
Okay. Where I'd like to go next, and this, I think all of you might have mentioned this component. So, and I'll begin with you, Mr. Zitti, and we'll go back around. Give me an example of either where the system has been tried successfully or where the ranked voting system has failed, and just kind of your favorite anecdote about a success or a failure.
I can go right to Aspen, Colorado, where it was tried. The voting system that was used, an electronic system by a company whose name escapes me, True Ballot, I think it was. They have had problems with that system, and the people have tried to get verification of the vote count and were not able to do so. I believe there were several CORA requests for it, and they still never got the data from the company. In addition to that, just this past November, there was a ballot initiative to do away with it, and that was just after one shot. So that's one example by itself.
Dr. Anastasia.
Should I not comment on that?
On yours, it's up to you.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you the one place that I am going to tell you about is Minneapolis, who's been doing it for a long time, and there 95% of at the exit polls, 95% of the population sees it as a very positive thing that's easy to understand. 65% at exit polls said that they believe that it should definitely continue in the future, and only 3% of the people that were voting said that they found it confusing. So I think that that's a good example, and they've been doing it a long time. So.
Well, I'll give you some examples that I pulled up. Ann Arbor, Michigan was one of the first places in the country to adopt the latest form of this IRV-RV system, and they've repealed it. Cary, North Carolina, 2007 elections were decided, and 22% of the voters said they didn't understand the system at all. And Cary has the highest percentage of PhDs per capita in the U.S., so it was a little difficult for them. And then in Burlington, Vermont, they've used it, they've repealed it there. the winners in the elections there did not receive a majority of the votes. And that's happened also in Pierce County, Washington, Memphis, and other places. The reason is, as you begin to count these votes, you're taking the person who gets the lowest number of votes and you're just kind of doing away with that candidate. And then you reestablish a way to move those ballots to the other candidates. So you're eliminating somebody. If you've got somebody who voted for that particular individual, then they may have just voted for that one person and not, that happens a lot, by the way. They'll just vote for one person instead of all three. They don't want the other two. They just don't. And then that person's ballot is literally tossed out. That reduces the denominator of the fraction that you're using to figure out what the percentage is. So as you work your way through, by the time you count those ballots 3-4 times, you may reduce what were 100 votes, as an example, down to as little as 60. The person wins that when they get 31 votes. Well, if you look at that compared to 100, it's really only 31%. That happens commonly in elections held under the RV system.
Mr. Fried.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Cary, North Carolina, because actually the people of Cary, North Carolina, when they were surveyed, they really liked the ranked voting they had, and the people wanted to keep it. It was the politicians in Cary, North Carolina, for whatever reason, that decided they didn't want to keep the system. I'm looking at a poll that was taken by North Carolina State University, Dr. Michael Cobb, and the key findings of his survey showed that 72% of Cary voters wanted to keep instant runoff voting, and only 28% wanted to go back to the old system, and 82% agreed that it was very easy to understand, actually. And everywhere they've done exit polling, they've found between 85 and 90% of the people like the system. Now, there's some people who don't like it. There's people who don't like our current system. There's only 3 places that I'm aware of in the whole country that have repealed IRV recently, 3 and only 3. There's a lot of bad information floating around on the internet, which, you know, you need to check the accuracy of some of the things you find on the internet. Some of the places that have been reputed to have repealed IRV, in fact, have not. Now, as for Aspen, that's a very complicated system. They came up with their own way of doing votes where you voted for 2 candidates at the same time, and they used a hybrid of a ranked voting system and an elimination system. I think it was overly complicated. That was their choice. But I wanted to do a real quick quote from Jack Johnson, who's a former city councilman in Aspen. And actually, when they had the one ranked voting election, they had a record turnout in Aspen, and things went very well. But then one of the losing candidates for mayor began raising all kinds of ruckus. They claimed criminality. They filed lawsuits. These things were thrown out. But what happened is it got so contentious that most of the good citizens of Aspen just threw up their hands and said, you know, we wanted a ranked voting system to have more civility in elections. That's not happening. We're going back to a traditional runoff system. I would point out, too, that every one of the 3 places that repealed instant runoff voting went back to a traditional runoff system where you have to have a majority to win. For Collins elections, you don't need any kind of majority or threshold to win. So none of them went back to the flawed system we have here.
Okay. And this is another place that all of you have gone in your answers already, so, but I'd like to go a little deeper. Why is it that people view this system as complex? Or why is it that it is a simple and portrayed as complex? Let's start, Dr. Anastasia, start with you.
You know, when I first started reviewing it on the task force, I thought it was complex, but I think that was because I was just flooded with so much information. When the first time that it clicked with me was when I really thought about it as if I were going to go buy ice cream. If I was going to go buy ice cream, I might have my top 3 ideas of which flavors I wanted, right? And I get to the store and my favorite one's not there, I go to my second choice. My second choice isn't there, I go to my third choice. That's all you do in ranked voting. It's not a difficult process to understand when you go to the polls. You basically rank what you want first, second, third. The reason that I find it very easy is because it's the method we use at our church for electing our deacons. And I've heard of numerous other churches that use the same exact method. So once you process it that way, the APA uses it to elect their officials. The bar system uses it to elect their officials. So it's one that most PhDs would understand. I'm not sure who they exit polled in Kerry in John's exit poll that he reviewed, but I'm pretty sure that most PhDs would understand it.
Mr. Clark.
Well, yeah, I have to admit, I only have a Master of Photography degree. I don't have a PhD. So maybe that's why it's so tough. But let me just give you a little flavor of what's in the actual Colorado revised statute that allows this. The ballot shall be counted in rounds simulating a series of runoffs until 2 candidates remain or until one candidate has more votes than the combined total of all other candidates. A candidate having the greatest number of votes shall be declared the winner. In each round of counting ballots, an election using instant runoff voting, each ballot shall be counted as a vote for the remaining candidate ranked highest by the elector, and the candidate with the smallest number of votes shall be eliminated. If 2 or more candidates tie for the smallest number of votes, a candidate to eliminate shall be chosen by lot. And this goes on. That doesn't sound too clear to me. I'm a pretty good reader, and I tend to comprehend what I read. I would have to sit down and flow this somehow and figure it out. And what's really scary, this is all done by a software program in a computer. And there are different computer software programs that if you feed the same information into those, you get different answers.
Mr. Freed?
I think it's actually fairly simple. I mean, you can look at it and make it more complicated than it is. I mean, I think we do this all the time. You want to go out to the movies, you have your choices. If the first one's at the wrong time or your compatriots don't want to go to that movie, what would you settle for as your second choice? If you can't do that, what's your third choice? That's really all you have to do. I wanted to show a little flow chart here that was produced by the people in Great Britain, because people may know that the entire nation of Great Britain is voting on whether to go to instant runoff voting in May. They call it alternative vote. They call the current system first past the post. And this first thing here is how you have to vote right now with first past the post. It's actually a lot more complicated, because you can't simply vote for your favorite candidate if there's more than 2 and your candidate may not win and you really hate another candidate. You want to make sure they don't win. I mean, I think we're all familiar with settling for the lesser of 2 evils. So you rank the candidates in order of preference in your head. You guess how everyone else is going to rank the candidates. Do you think your candidate has a chance of winning? No chance. Well, is it going to be close between the other 2 candidates? Then maybe you want to vote for one of those candidates. If it's not close, go ahead and vote for your preference. If it is close, vote for your favorite, etc. That's kind of complicated with the current system. We just don't think about that. Ranked voting, think about the order you like the candidates in, 1, 2, 3, vote for them that way. End of story.
Mr. City?
Well, this is voting for an elected official, okay? Whether it's a plurality that they receive to win or a majority that they receive to win, they will be governing people's lives in some, or affecting their lives in some aspect. It's not like picking ice cream, your favorite ice cream. I like all ice cream pretty much, so you know, that for me would be an easy choice. If they ran out of every flavor and they just had one left, I'd still choose one. It's not like that when it comes down to voting for a representative. And, you know, clubs and organizations are completely different. Churches, Republican Party, picking the Heisman Trophy winner, those are all different than the consideration of picking a representative to represent you as a government official. My own preference, I could not vote for some people. So I would end up spoiling my ballot if I couldn't get past the first round, because I would decide on choosing someone, and I mean, that's how our politics works. We coalesce behind a candidate. We try and either convince them or they convince us that they would represent us with our values and principles that we like, or at least the majority of our values and principles that we like, and we would then have some influence with them or they with us in order to win our respect and in turn our vote. And when hopefully you can make them a winner in that regard. And then you would have representation that would be by the most of the people. It may not be everything that you want, that's true, but it still works, and it has worked for a long, long time, which is why we end up really with the 2-party system we have now, I believe anyway.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that is pervasive in the stack of cards that I've gotten from the audience is about cost and of implementation and development and educating the public and the various other opportunity costs that one can envision. I'd like to hear each of you speak to this idea, and we'll start with Mr. Clark. And
well, I need to go back to the original idea that I suggested, that instead of using this ranked voting process, we simply change the municipal elections to coincide with the elections in the fall every other year. And those are elections that are already being held. There is an additional cost to the city, of course, to get on those ballots because they're not city elections, but it can be done. It was done most recently with the sales tax issue that was passed in November. The city paid a fee to the county clerk in order to handle that aspect of the voting. So, but it's going to be it's going to save money because you're not going to have to do the education that's required and required in statute when this particular process was approved by the state legislature. So you're going to save that because you don't have to train people to go vote in November. They are already studying issues. They're looking at candidates. They're deciding how they're going to vote. For the average person, it makes it for them much more efficient than having to do that again in the spring. So when you're talking about cost, this will save money to do it the way I suggested it, whether you use the existing system of a spring election or whatever. But we do want to do things in an efficient way and a cost-effective way in government. But we don't in any way want to scrimp and cut a corner when it's going to affect the kind of decisions that we get. And I submit that an election in the fall where the turnout is double that of any election that's ever been held on a municipal basis is the best way to get a decision out of the voters.
Mr. Frieden.
Well, I guess I may surprise people and say I don't disagree with you. I have no objection to moving the elections to the fall. However, that's not on the ballot in April. The question on the ballot in April is whether to use a ranked voting system or continue to use a plurality system. And that doesn't, moving the elections to the fall doesn't preclude the change as well. Now, in terms of the cost, there may be an added cost. We don't know for sure. Some of us from the Fort Collins ranked voting met with the city clerk a couple of times. We tried to get them to study the question, exactly what would it take to have a ranked voting election in Fort Collins. They didn't want to do that until they waited to see if this thing passed on April 5th. So we don't have a measure from them. However, what you need to do with a ranked voting system is count the ballots centrally and scan them all in. Well, Fort Collins already does that. Fort Collins already counts all the ballots centrally. It's an all mail-in ballot. So we're 95% of the way there already. They already scanned them in. All they have to do then is basically capture the ballot images and use software that can manipulate 1, 2, 3 votes. You know, it's not rocket science in the 21st century to count, well, if this vote drops out and it rolls over to the second choice, then you add them up again. And Fort Collins doesn't own its own voting equipment anyway. They rent it from various election vendors. So at the next election, if this passes, they would simply have to put it in their proposal that the vendor would have to be able to provide a ranked voting count. So we think it might add $5,000 to $10,000 or less to the cost. Their budget is somewhere between $100,000 to $150,000 for elections out of a city budget of hundreds of millions of dollars. The question is, how much is good governance worth? We think it's worth that cost. Now then, you do have to educate the voters because it is a change. You know, we're used to just marking one. But I think that the news media, organizations like the League of Women Voters and CSU's Center for Public Deliberation will help educate the voters. We could probably get community-oriented foundations to raise some money too. So that cost might not even come out of the city's budget.
Mr. Zitti.
I beg to differ with that analogy that it won't continue to raise significant costs. Some of the municipalities, they may be bigger than ours, of course, but Pierce County, Washington, they did away with it, and they saved $500,000 right off the bat. I believe it was San Francisco. Their ongoing costs are around $240,000 per election, and that's an ongoing cost, not startup costs. So the implementation of ranked voting will increase the cost to the city. There's no doubt in my mind. I've tried to find out what those costs might even be. I have a report from the Secretary of State's office. He doesn't know what those costs will be. He's tried to find out, ascertain some figures from both Aspen and from the city of Fort Collins, and neither answered him. So there are the systems are upfront costs, of course, first of all, and I have no clue what that might be. The implementation for new voting equipment that they may need to buy, I don't know if they would or not. There are more complicated ballots. We have mail-in ballots here, so How big is that ballot going to be? It's going to cost more to mail it, more to produce it, and things of that nature. How about training for not just the public to use it, but how about the people that are going to count it and administer this? So there'll be administrative costs and ongoing costs, because our election cycles are, what, every 2 years or something like that. You can't take for granted that the voters will remember the last time you went around and taught them everything. You have to continue to do it. So while I agree there may be some outside organizations that are willing to help with that, it's not the responsibility of them to do that, especially when we have a system right now that's simple, verifiable, and easy to understand. You just mark your ballot.
Dr. Anastasia.
In San Francisco, $240,000 doesn't seem like a lot to me for the size of their city. And also, remember that San Francisco was one of the first towns to put this in place. So they're running on old equipment and old software that actually they had to pay to have it developed. Because they've already paid to have it developed, it's going to cost us less to use that same software. So those companies, they basically are still paying back what all of their upfront costs were on getting that established in the first place. So we actually have them to thank for reducing our costs. Scott Doyle was actually on the Voter Choice Task Force, and so was another clerk in El Paso County clerk was actually on that task force as well. Both of them agreed, and it's on public record, that it would not be a significant increase in cost given the types of equipment that they both had already in their county, and the fact that they are already having to lease some of their equipment. They can just lease different equipment. So it's not going to be a significant difference based on, and that's directly from Scott Doyle, and that was to the task force.
One thing that, another question that seems pervasive in this stack of questions that I've been getting, let me see if I can summarize it this way. How are, under the ranked voting system, how would voter preference be better expressed than it is now? Mr. Freed.
Well, right now, if there's 3 candidates in the race, say, and 2 of them are similar, then they may divide up the votes of a similar voting pool, and the other side will win. Or a lot of times, let me give you a better example. Your favorite candidate might be unlikely to win. And if you vote for that candidate instead of your second choice candidate, then the candidate you hate the worst is going to win. So therefore, a lot of times if your candidate is not likely to win, you wind up not voting for your favorite candidate. You vote for one of the 2 leading candidates that you like best. So you haven't actually voted for the candidate you like, and that happens fairly often. Let's say you've got a race with a Republican, a Libertarian, and a Democrat. Well, the conservatives might want to vote for the Libertarian, but they're not likely to win. If they vote for that Libertarian, they're going to elect the Democrat. So they wind up voting for the Republican, and therefore we don't know how much support that third party or independent or grassroots candidate really has. But with the ranked voting system, there's no reason not to do that. You can vote for your favorite candidate first. If that candidate is eliminated, your vote rolls over to your second choice. A lot of times in pre-election polling, independent candidates poll pretty well. Rudy mentioned a 2-party system before. The reality is in Colorado and Larimer County, 1/3 of the electorate is unaffiliated. 1/3 of the electorate is not in either major party. And in many counties, unaffiliated voters are more than either Democrats or Republicans. But how is that preference expressed? In a lot of pre-election polls, the independent polls pretty well, but they don't do that well in the voting booth itself, because people get in the voting booth and think, well, if I vote for the independent, then either the Democrat or the Republican is going to win, depending on which side you fall on. With the ranked voting system, you can vote for the independent. There's no reason not to. And there's no reason for candidates not to run, because they won't be taking votes away from similar candidates and acting as a spoiler. So I think you get a more authentic representation of the electorate. You get more information out of the voters than you do with simply mark one.
Mr. City.
Well, I can appreciate that. And in theory, it sounds great. But in reality, I don't think it works as well as you say it is. I have 2 articles right here, one from the San Francisco Examiner and the other from the San Francisco Gate from Oakland. In both of these elections, the third means you can win. Oakland ranked ballot, least hated tops the most liked. So after a number of runoffs, and in this one particular instance in San Francisco, I believe, the person who won was not the most popular person in the entire election, and they had something like, I don't know, 20 runoffs before they actually were able to select the winner, who did not win with a majority of the votes. She only won with about 4,200 votes, I believe. There were 9,000 spoiled ballots. So, and this was a huge city, in fact. So that election became more complex and even more messed up because of this system. I don't see how adding more candidates to the mix solves the spoiler effect. It only makes it even more complicated. And if you're going to sort of spin the roulette wheel and you know, cast your vote for your guy and hope that the ticker lands on that person, that's not really, I think, a way that we should be conducting governance. That's not good governance. I believe that if you're a candidate, that it's your obligation to represent as many people as you can in order to win. And then once you've won, you represent everybody in that community. So,
Dr. Anastasia.
At this point, I've forgot the question.
Sorry. How does the ranked voting system better express the preferences of the electorate?
Okay. Well, first, it does eliminate the spoiler effect. I mean, that's been proven over and over again. And the spoiler effect is very real. I mean, how many times there have been numerous times where I myself have voted for what I would term the lesser of two evils. Because I know that the candidate that I really want doesn't have a chance because they're not part of one of the main two parties. And that's happened to me numerous times personally, and I've talked to numerous people that's also happened to. So one of the big benefits to me is that the increased positive campaigning, and the reason that comes about is because what Rudy was talking about really is that to serve the people, you then campaign on what you really believe in. You're trying to rally people around the benefits, not tear down your opponent. Because you're not going just for first place votes, you're also going for second choice votes. And so you're less likely to be negative in your campaigning. And that has been shown to be true over and over and over again in these cases.
Ms. Clark.
Well, with all due respect, I was in an election campaign once with 19 candidates. It was like a zoo when we went to give our little speeches. And there got to be some very heated discussions between the people in that group of 19. We weren't running for Miss Congeniality or Mr. Congeniality. The issues were still there. They were still very important to people, and it really was an interesting situation.
But you weren't going for second choice votes.
Well, the point is that there were 3 people elected out of that group of 19, so yes, you were, because anybody could win, allegedly. But there were 3 chosen from 19, and there was still plenty of dissension and discussion. Here's the problem that I see, though, to answer the question maybe a little more directly. This particular process can give some very, very interesting aberrations. For instance, there is a situation where one candidate in Aspen, if that individual had asked their supporters, 75 of the supporters, instead of picking them as number 1, to pick them as their number 3 choice, they would have won because of the way the votes would have fallen as votes were counted, people eliminated, and it all added up. Now that's nuts. That doesn't make any sense. I say let's go out there. If we need to have some kind of a preliminary campaign, we can do it. There are preliminary elections. There are those primaries that occur in those years, and I keep pounding on this drum. But this is not a problem that cannot be solved and make these folks happy. But the way they're trying to do it is expensive, risky, silly, in my opinion, and it can be handled in a much, much better, more efficient way and get where they would like to be.
In my class today, I in fact taught this at least some of the different voting methods that are out there. And one thing that my students came across with in their understanding and kind of the questions that were generated was the idea about how this affects or promotes the two-party system or affects or does damage to the two-party system. And Mr. Freed, you were talking about this earlier about, you know, the ability of voters to express, because if you're thinking about this system, it does promote more candidates. And that can somewhat go outside of the two-party system that we have. Is that, I guess, without a better way to phrase it, is that normatively pleasing to all of you? Is that more, I mean, this kind of gets to the point you were making, Mr. Clark, about do we want more candidates or less, and is that one of the main motivations of this ranked voting system?
Do you want to start with me?
Yeah.
Yeah, as I think what we saw in the last elections is that voters more and more are trying to find alternatives beyond the two-party system. And in the last national election, we saw how there was a tremendous upwelling of people outside of the traditional party system who were not happy with the choices being offered. And whether you're on the left or the right, a lot of people think both of the major parties are more similar than they're different, and they're looking for alternatives. But the system we have now tends to restrict people's choices. Now that said, on a national level, Fort Collins city elections are officially nonpartisan. Right. I think most people know which team different candidates are playing on, but you don't run as a member of a party. But it still restricts the choices. And I'll give you an example from the current election. Up until last week, we had 3 candidates running in District 2. Again, there's the incumbent, Lisa Papa, then we had Sue Pollack, and then we had Steve Urash. Steve dropped out. And I think the reason is because he felt that he wanted Lisa Papa to be defeated, and Sue Pollack had a better chance, and if he ran, then he would split votes with Sue Pollack, and that would maybe give Lisa Papa a better chance of winning. There's no reason that should happen. There's no reason a candidate should not be able to run, present their point of view. People could vote for them as their first choice, maybe Sue as their second choice, whatever. And we've seen that in the mayor's race too. We had a libertarian candidate for mayor who withdrew, and so now we're down to 3 candidates. In the last election cycle in Fort Collins, same thing happened. For mayor, 1 candidate more on the left, 1 more on the right dropped out because they did not want to split the votes. And I think with a ranked voting system, you wouldn't have that. You'd be able to do that. Just look at the last Colorado governor's race, where you had Dan Mace as the Republican candidate, and then you had Tom Tancredo running on the American Constitution Party. Okay, the American Constitution Party is not one of the 2 major parties. He got 37% of the vote. And eventually, Hickenlooper got a little over 50% of the vote, so it wasn't really an issue. But it was quite possible up until the end that Hickenlooper would have gotten less than a majority. A majority would have voted clearly their preference for one of the conservative candidates and lost anyway. And that seems to me fundamentally unfair. So I guess I'm not a huge fan of the 2-party system. I'm more interested in what's good for we the people rather than what's good for either political party.
Mr. Zitti.
Well, what I think is fundamentally unfair is the fact that you are actually forcing people to make a second and third choice if they don't desire that. My second and third choices, or even fourth choices, may not go, they go against my beliefs and my values. So I would not vote for a second or third person unless there was somebody there that I liked. Now, while you say that there could be more candidates in the mix, but I still don't see how that solves the problem. This is from San Francisco, the last election in November. Look at all the candidates that they have. Because there were so many candidates, you end up fracturing off into all these splinter groups and special interests and with various ideologies. I don't think this helps the electoral process at all. This woman won with 4,321 votes, 24.3% of the vote. She won the election. There were 9,500 exhausted ballots. She won with less of a vote than there were exhausted ballots. So to me, she doesn't have the consensus or the will of the people at hand. She has just due to this complicated theorem, she ends up winning this race. And in theory, there is a study from Grasinski. He's a professor at Vermont, University of Vermont. And he puts it quite simply. He says, you're using a mathematical theorem to fix a political problem, to resolve a political problem. Ranked voting encourages groups with special interests or ideologies not to work together and to put up their own candidates. They do not work together in order to resolve their political differences. Trying to resolve this issue using a technological fix can produce these kind of voting paradoxes or perverse outcomes, where a minor candidate with little overall support at all in a head-to-head race can be elected to office. So that's my theory on it.
Dr. Anastasio.
The thing is that with a minor candidate who never runs because they know that they're going to spoil something, you reduce the choices of the people. And I, for one, like to choose a lot of different types of ice cream. So I would rather have choice. I would like to have seen the 5 people that were going to run for mayor in 2009. I would have liked to have seen all 5 of them on the ballot instead of just the 3 that were there. I would have liked to have seen the 2 that have already dropped out this year on the ballot. I think that it's only fair to us that we get to hear their voices. And by having them drop out early, we don't even get to hear their voices. We don't even know these perspectives, so we don't know what other options there are out there because we only hear 2 extreme sides repeatedly. And I, for one, would like to see some middle ground at some point.
Mr. Clark?
Well, this cuts both ways, and I've seen it on both sides. Let me give you another side. The other side is an election I was in once. I ran for the state house. I had a vision of being a representative from District 52. Wow. And I ran really hard, and there was a libertarian in that race also. And I think most people know that if libertarians don't have a libertarian to vote for, they'll often vote for the Republican. That was me. And the libertarian got I lost that election, and the Libertarian got the votes that if I'd have had them, I would have beat the other guy. And so I understand that, but it cuts both ways. And nobody made these candidates that dropped out do that. They did that of their own free will, and because they wanted to see something else happen. And why should we say, well, run anyway and we'll figure it out with this complicated system that doesn't always work right? And so I'm just saying this thing will work both ways, and you can't argue one way and the other because it goes both ways. But the system, the basic system of ranked voting is one that is fraught with problems. It gives weird results, and I'd say we ought to just have a primary and then a general election and be done with it.
Okay. Another theme that's pervasive through these questions, what other changes, and you can frame this as in your opposition or as in your support, what other changes to the system will be apparent to voters under the ranked voting system, other than the basic working system where you rank the candidates at the ballot box? What else is going to be obvious to voters, and how will implementation of those rules change the politics? We've talked about this a little bit already, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper into it. Mr. Ziti, you go first.
Well, if I understand the question correctly, I think that in the long run it doesn't change the politics. And in fact, there's been some data that proves that fact. Australia, Malta, the other place escapes me at the moment, but they've been using the system for years, and they are 2-party dominated. So that dispels that theory right there when they've been using it for a very long time. So I don't see what it's going to solve, really. And it just adds more confusing to the electoral process, as far as I'm concerned, for the reasons I stated before.
Dr. Anastasio, you talked about lowering the amount of negative campaigning. What else? I mean, that's an important point, but what?
Right, well, reduce negative campaigning, but I think the last point that I made, which is giving voice to more people, I think is really a critical one. If there were 19 people that were running, then those 19 people would have a voice in debates. They would have a voice in media. They would have a voice in a lot of different other avenues. And the way it is now, those voices are silently squelched because we basically have a system that only allows for 2 voices to truly be heard. And those 2 voices ring louder because they are the dominant parties. And that does not necessarily mean that they represent the majority. The fact that we had a mayor elected with 29% of the vote just about a decade ago tells me, and that was only with 6 people running, 29% of the vote. Was that a majority? No. Was that representative of the real voices of the people? We will never know.
Mr. Clark?
How will it change the system? I'm starting to see this already. Almost 2 weeks ago on a Sunday afternoon, the folks who were in support of this proposal had a big kind of a rally, I guess you'd call it, and I talked to somebody who was there who wrote down this quote. There was an individual there named Tim Caffrey who stood on the stage and introduced himself as being associated with unions, the NOCO Labor Council specifically. We even I saw his card, so I know that that's who it was. And he said he's admitted to writing a check to support ranked voting elections, and he said, quote, "Trust me, a lot of dollars are being spent to support ranked voting." Well, I have to ask, where's this money coming from? Because there is evidence in other parts of the country that up to 75 to 80% of the money to get this passed comes from outside that jurisdiction. And I am very concerned about what's happening with this issue right now, that there's a lot of money coming in. It's common knowledge on the street that Eric's looking for a storefront to open up, and he's offered to pay the rent in advance for the time, and that's fine to do it. But my only question would be, since you don't have to tell us where the money came from until 21 days before, where are you getting that money? Is it local? Is it coming from this union group? Where's it coming from? And even when it does come, is it going to come from a group like Citizens for Great Elections? And you don't even know where that money really came from because it's an organization put up just to put up the money. So when you talk about the way this is going to change elections in Fort Collins, I'm seeing it right now with this issue, and I don't like it.
Mr. Freed?
Well, I'm not sure that what you just said had anything to do with the actual question that was asked, but I do admit that we're looking for an office to have volunteers in and have our yard signs in. I don't see anything nefarious about that. We're thinking if we can raise $30,000, we can run our whole campaign. Past ballot initiative campaigns have spent upwards of $100,000, so that doesn't seem entirely out of order. We do need to print yard signs. We do need to pay for literature, so I don't see anything nefarious there. In terms of how it changes elections, ranked voting tends to promote more candidates. Right now, as we've talked about before, certain groups they don't run candidates for office because they're afraid of being spoilers or splitting the vote. So I know that students in this city, there's 20,000 students at Colorado State University, feel entirely underrepresented on council. But they're afraid to run candidates because they may take votes away from someone similar to them and cause someone very unlike them to win. I believe if we have a ranked voting election, you'll see more student participation in our civic life. I think that's a good thing. I know that the Labor Council and working people in this city also feel underrepresented. They don't feel that there's really anybody on council who understands or responds to their point of view. And so the Labor Council has endorsed the ranked voting proposal, as has a number of elected officials, as has the local League of Women Voters. And I suspect that if this passes, we might see a Labor candidate run. We might see more Latino candidates. We might see more poorer people running for office, which we don't see right now. Right now we see kind of a homogeneous council, and a few groups are represented and many are not. So I think we'll see more groups get involved in city elections. That's a good thing. We'll also see more positive campaigning. Right now with with just plurality system, if I'm running against Rudy, then if I can take votes away from Rudy, I win the election. So therefore the incentive for me is to run slick negative hit pieces against Rudy, insinuating all kinds of things and drive down his votes. But with a ranked voting system with multiple candidates, I want his voters to rank me second. I want to get the second choice vote, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say, well, I agree with him on this issue. We disagree on this issue. He's a good person. Please make me your second choice. So it promotes a more positive culture of campaigning. We've seen that in places like Oakland, where the person who won was not the machine candidate who outspent the others 3-1. That was the person who had the most first place votes. But after that, almost everyone didn't like that candidate. They got almost no second and third choice votes. And the winner was a neighborhood candidate and Oakland's first Asian American and first woman mayor, heavily outspent, and she won. I think Oakland's a big success story, and I think we'll see more our voting change to something more like that with ranked voting.
Okay, we've got 4 minutes. I'm giving each one of you 1 minute to give your best argument. Mr. Zitti, go.
Okay, well, I'm going to take some of my time up to say that in that one particular mayoral election where the mayor, who was Ray Martinez, won with 25% of the vote, he won the very next election with 85% of the vote. So I think that theory is wrong. I just don't understand where the compelling argument is to change our current system. Who's advocating the change? What's the flaw in the way we do things now? And what are we really trying to fix here? And I don't think that ranked voting solves any of these issues. As I said before, we've been down this road before with history, and it was done away with then, and it was a lot easier to count votes then, I would imagine, and a lot less money involved in our elections. So there could be a lot of things in the electoral system that need changing, maybe nicer campaigns, or at least truth in campaigning and truth in advertising and things of that nature. Campaign finance laws could probably use a serious overhaul, but throwing away our current electoral system, which is simple, is not one of them. Dr.
Anastasia.
Well, thanks for doing this. This has been really helpful and hopefully helpful for the community as well. I believe that we need it because I really want majority winners. And if we were to institute runoff elections, it would be very, very expensive. So I think we're in a situation where if we want majority winners, we want to have people have a voice. These things have been shown to produce more voter turnout. So all those individuals who currently feel disenfranchised, who aren't voting because they feel like they're worried about the spoiler effect or they feel like their voice doesn't count, will now feel like they've got a voice. We'll have more people voting. We'll have more candidates running, so we'll have more choices. We'll decrease the spoiler effect, and we'll have increased positive campaigning. So there you go.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Clark.
Well, I would just like to again endorse my idea that we ought to defeat this and then go ahead and change the charter and have our November elections. But beyond that, let me also talk about some of the other things that concern me. There are organizations that have typically gone into these kinds of elections. I've mentioned one, the NOCO union that's involved, but there's another organization, fairvote.org. And when the folks who are in favor of this show their money report, 15th of March or thereabouts, which they'll have to do under the election laws, I have to wonder, is Fair Vote going to be one of the folks who've put money into this? They're an organization with in excess of $1 million budget a year, and they get involved in these things, and they could decide to get involved. They have before. And I don't like the idea of people from outside coming here and trying to run our elections and spend a lot of money. I've fought against those things for my entire political involvement in this town. And with all due respect to Eric, he still never told us where he's going to get the money to pay the rent on that store. Is it coming from local folks who've given him money or not?
Mr. Freed.
Well, in terms of the local nature of the campaign, the only reason this is on the ballot is because we collected 4,000 signatures from voters all across Fort Collins, which it all came up from the grassroots. We're hoping to raise money from everyone watching at home. Send us a check. Go to www.fortcollinsrankedvoting.org and click on the donate button. We do hope we get some money from Fair Vote. Fair Vote supports ranked voting. When a Republican runs for office, they tend to get money from the Republican Governors Association or the Republican Senatorial Committee. There's nothing wrong with people who support what you're doing giving you money for what you're doing. But we hope to get most of the money locally. The real problem is that in over 40% of city elections in the last decade, there have been 3 or more candidates, and in over half of those, the winner has not gotten a majority. So we don't know how the majority feels, and the system we have now prevents people from running for office. If you've ever felt compelled to vote for a candidate who is not your first choice, if you've ever felt you needed to settle for the lesser of 2 evils, if you ever wondered, is this really the best we can do, then you support ranked voting.
And that concludes our discussion for this evening. Thank you for joining us in the audience, and thank you for joining us at home. Good night.